I spent 2 years learning how to make my dream game. 2 years ago, I embarked on a journey I had no idea was going to take me this long. But here I am, 2 years after, with a clearer path than I've ever had. I'm making Returner, a Metroidvania game where you can possess any enemy and make use of their abilities for combat and traversal. So how did I get here? OG subscribers of my channel must have seen the video of a Hollow Knight clone I made. Yeah, it's obvious that it's a clone. The problem with making a clone is that it can never be like the original. It's almost impossible to make a better Hollow Knight than Team Cherry, especially if you are a solo dev like I am. So I've spent the last 1 year figuring out the best direction for my game that's good enough, different from Hollow Knight, and brings something new to the Metroidvania genre. Here's the progress so far. The main mechanic of my Metroidvania game is called lunging. It's a special ability you use to possess enemies for combat against other enemies or for difficult traversals. I think enemy possession is a really fun idea that doesn't get used a lot in video games. Imagine a scenario where boss ads are no longer a pain in the ass, but a tool you can actually use against bosses in combat. I really think it will be fun. The problem with this idea though is that making it fun and robust enough is a huge undertaking. Imagine this, you have 50 enemies in the game. There are enemies that can move horizontally, some vertically, some both. There are flying enemies, hopping enemies, swimming enemies, enemies with weapons, enemies that detonate on contact, stationary enemies, and so on. Just imagine how complicated the character controller will be if you want the player to be able to control all these enemy types in a fun way that doesn't feel half baked. It's possible if I want to release my game in 10 years. Apart from the fact that it's a pain in the ass to develop, I also don't think it's going to be much fun for players trying to learn and master 50 different controls and abilities for enemies. So for the past year, I've been prototyping different ideas on how to make this work and make it easy to set up for new enemies. And I'm happy to say, I think I found a solution. Until I get feedback from the first playtest that will be coming up by the end of next month. If you want to give me feedback and help me make my game better, join my Discord channel where updates about the playtest will be announced. So what exactly is this solution? Well, let me explain. Instead of making the player take total control of an enemy when it's possessed, players instead have the ability to steer enemy movements and activate a one-time enemy ability. Think of it this way, you are suddenly able to take control of a raging and berserk zombie in World War Z, but you can only steer its direction while running or activate its special explosion ability. It might sound restrictive, but I think this is the kind of interaction that encourages the fast-paced gameplay I want for my game. When you possess enemies, it's like a temporary infection that turns them into the infected runners in The Last of Us, driven only by their need to attack others, even other enemies, with the only difference being that the player has control on the direction of the attack and when they attack. Why is this simpler than having the player have total control? Number one, most enemies now have at least one common possession state across board, which is the berserk state. We set the expectation that once you possess this enemy, they move exactly the way they move while not possessed, except faster. So there won't be any need to teach the player the movement abilities of each enemy. You can already understand that in context. Players can also easily predict the actions and abilities for enemies based on their movesets in the idle states and combat states. Controls are much simpler for players. Players mostly have to use the direction buttons to drive the enemy and interact buttons to use their special abilities. That's 2 buttons. There won't be any need to figure out if an enemy can jump, swing a sword, or dodge. For deeper gameplay, enemies can easily be tiered up and lower enemies can be much more receptive to possession, while higher tier enemies can be much more resistant or even able to shield themselves from possession. I think that's a fun mechanic to have in the game. And an important one is that enemy states and animations can easily be reused for their possession states, which makes it faster for me as the developer to develop this game. This all sounds good in theory, and I've been enjoying playing with this mechanic for the past few months, but ultimately a lot of changes are going to be made to it based on feedback from playtesters. The lunging mechanic is not only for enemy possession, it also works purely for movement purposes. It's an equivalent of dash in other games that makes you move faster in a particular direction. I initially thought about having a special dash ability, but I feel like that might be too confusing for players, having 2 mechanics that does essentially the same thing. It would be nice to hear what you have to say about that. One major downside of lunging though is that each lunge you attempt uses the lunging resource. Lunging costs 2 resources, and at the start of the game, the player only has access to 4 of those resources, That means the player can only use the launch twice without hitting an enemy before their resource is depleted. Imagine this: you are stuck in the middle of a difficult platforming section and you run out of resource. Now you are stuck in an impossible situation that requires you to reload the game. For such a core mechanic in the game, this can be frustrating because that means players essentially now have to go and farm lunging resource by hitting enemies, and that's an experience I don't really want for my game. My solution to this was actually very simple. It was to automatically replenish the first 2 lunging resource after it's depleted, to make it impossible to run out of it. The only downside is that you might have to wait a couple of seconds. As you progress in the game, I may also add some upgrades that make the lunging resource replenish faster. Possession as it is currently already constrained, and one thing I have done to allow the player more freedom is to remove any time limitation for possession. Usually in games like this, there is a countdown for how long you can control enemies or an actively draining resource that stops the possession once it's depleted. In Returner, it's not like that. Once you spend your resource to possess an enemy, you can possess them forever until you collide with something, use the enemy's special ability, or exit the possession yourself. I believe this is much more fun than stifling the player's freedom through time limitation. The caveat is that there might be specialized enemies like bosses that resist the player's possession control the longer you possess them. I haven't exactly figured out how that will work yet, but for the lower tier enemies, possession time is infinite. The lunging and possession mechanic is a complex mechanic under the hood that leads to a lot of fun gameplay, and as time goes on, I'll be exposing more of how this mechanic works. If you also want to experience it yourself, join my Discord channel to learn when the playtest starts. That will be all for this devlog. Thanks for sticking around to the end. In the next devlog, I'm going to be talking about the art and animation process that has made it easier and faster for someone like me with no art background to be able to make manageable art for my game.